Hey guys, can you hear me? Hear me? Okay, welcome. It's Mr. A, or you can find me on Instagram at Art with Anderson. So today I'm going to be sketching from basically your requests, but I have a few things that I want to get started on. I'm going to do some lettering stuff, so if you need to make a sign, express your views at any point, this is going to be a good way to do it. Let's see if we can just double check everything's working. Okay, welcome. Yeah, looks like it is. Mr. A. So, I am going to be doing some crazy stuff, but let me write down that Instagram if you looking to post anything. So, the main thing is on Insta. It's going to be at art_with Anderson. So if you haven't already followed me, be sure, if you're going to sketch along today at any point, or you make something with what we do, be sure to tag me on Instagram with any of your artwork, and I'll like and comment and stuff. But yeah, I'd love to check out what you guys do. But in the chat, hop in and request anything. If you've been struggling to draw something, or you want to see me interpret a challenge, I'd be happy to. But the thing I'm going to start off with today is a quick thing. I've taught a lot of my students this, but to make lettering. So this is a good way to do it. But if the people watching have already seen this stuff or find it boring, comment and tell me what you want me to draw today. I could do some perspective drawing. I could even do watercolor if you really want me to, or you just have like some, I don't know, some character you want me to try to draw. I'll try to find it. So I'm just gonna be here for about like an hour or two. So here we go. So what I want to start with is, like, if you're gonna be drawing lettering, I've found this technique really easy. But to start off, I want you guys to think in terms of what a letter is. Let's just think of the letter O. The letter O. Right now, I want you to think about the white of the paper over here and the white of the paper inside here. Okay? What we call that, if we think of this as a letter, you know, where it's an O, we think of this as a hole, right? And this is kind of the space behind it. But the other thing is this could be an egg, right? If we shaded this in, you'd be like, oh, that's a solid thing, right? So how do we tell the difference between whether something is an actual form or not? And that's a tricky idea that we play with as artists. So what we use to describe something that's a space or a hole in between two things is going to be positive and negative space. So you can look at it as a plus and a minus. Positive space is something that actually exists, right? And negative space is something that's like doesn't exist, you know, so put an X through it. So think about the letter O again. If I were to write this out, we see this as the letter O, but the negative space is inside, like this hole is a space, it's negative, and same thing over here. But the line itself is positive because it actually exists, and we see that as like the symbol that we're drawing. The other way to look at this is think of a block letter. So for example, if I had the same O shape, but I draw this inner circle, we start to see this as more of a letter, especially if we shade this in. So with this, the positive space is in the black. Sorry, I was getting a phone call. Oops. 1 second. Basically your request, but I have a few things that I want to get. I'm going to do some lettering stuff, so if you... Alright, sorry about that. So what I'm going to do here is think about this. Again, the black is the actual object, so it's positive, and then negative space is the whole and the outside, the thing that's not the actual object. So when it comes to drawing letters, when we're writing things, when we learn how to write, we're used to drawing the positive space. The letters are actually the positive space. We very rarely think about the spaces in between, all this negative space around, or the little holes that we create. So by focusing on the negative space, a lot of people say to stay positive, but for drawing, it's actually a lot easier if you focus on the negative space, especially when you're coming to letters. And I'll show you exactly why that's a good strategy. So check this out. I want you to start thinking about letters almost like a sculptor would look at a big cube of stone. So I'm going to put a couple of rectangles or blocks in between here. They're all the same height. We're going to do some lettering. We're going to focus on the letters themselves and their negative spaces, and we'll create the positive space by focusing on the negative. So think of this as a solid rock, and we need to remove or carve away the negative space. So I'm going to start off with the letter A. Okay? Now I want you to think of this, if we put it inside of a box like this, we can break it up into a couple different shapes. So if you look closely, we have a triangle on either side, a trapezoid here, and a triangle in the middle. So we have a triangle on this side, right, like those two. A trapezoid is basically two parallel lines that meet up like this, where these two are the same, and then we have a triangle like that. But I'm going to focus on the shape of this using the lines that are already drawn. So the key is to use the full height and go to the corners of the lines when possible. So I'm going to draw this line to the side, not quite in the center. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, these are my two negative spaces on the side, so I've carved those out. I'm going to do the trapezoid, but I'm going to try to stay parallel with this line, and I'm going to go straight across. Okay, now we're going to put in this triangle. I'm going to try to imagine where that line goes. And as you notice, this is kind of a perfect block letter when it comes down to nothing has crossed over. Because if we tried to draw that letter like this, we'd have all of these weird intersections. It's not quite perfect. How many of you guys have ever drawn, let's look at another letter, B. I want to just introduce, if you can make a parentheses and you can make a capital D shape, you can make this letter. I've already drawn the top, bottom, and the left side line, right? So I'm just going to trim off this round part here, another round part here. Then I'm going to put a little, I don't know, I call it a butt crack, or like a seagull. Put it right here. And then I'm just going to put two capital D shapes right here. So I've focused on carving it out of a solid object so I get a solid block letter. So this is super helpful if you are, especially if you are like doing something that is like making a sign for an event or something, so you can actually count out your squares and then make perfect spacing. Let's start with another C. The C is rounded all the way around, so I'm going to put those trimming marks, the rounded parentheses, on the top and the bottom. Okay. Now the trick is, how do we find out where we're going to do another set of parentheses that are facing each other, but just turn it like this. So smaller set here, here. Can you guys see the letter C yet? I'm going to connect this line with a straight line down and two horizontal lines here. Right? So at this point you're probably like, okay, those are pretty easy letters. What about something like, let's do an E. Even simpler, I'm going to put in two rectangles. Right? If I wanted an F, I would have just brought that down. Okay, an L is just one box. But let's do something a little bit more crazy. How about like an M? So if you ever need to like figure this out for yourself, think about a letter and then make a square out of it, or a rectangle. I see three triangles. The trick is balancing where you start the triangle. So here's one. I'm going to go towards the middle. Same thing, identical but flipped. And then I'm going to do a triangle down here. Now I have an M. But notice that I use the top, bottom, left and right sides of this stuff. You're probably wondering about the hardest one. If you've ever tried to make an S into a block letter, you probably started like this. And it gets all weird and squashed on one side. We can avoid that right here. So look, I'm going to do that same parentheses just like I'm making a C or an O, top and bottom, and a smaller set in between. Now the trick is, starting with this inner left part of this, we're going to be snaking this over down to here, onto the right side. So inside to outside with a smooth curve. And then this outside to the inside, trying to keep it nice and even, round it out, and voila, we have our S. So this is a really easy way to start with thinking about negative spaces in order to define a shape that you need to make. Now the other cool part about this is that, you know, we can do individual blocks, but let's say you had a piece of paper that was this big and you knew you had to fit, you know, 4 letters on your first word, so you draw a rectangle. Instead of drawing all these letters and then ending up with, you know, squash letters over here, you could divide this into the 4 letters and space this stuff out. Even before you draw out the actual letters, you're all set. So you're never going to be able to convince yourself that crunching all those letters in your sign is acceptable from here on out. And then the other really cool thing is you can warp those things. So if you have something like a banner, you can also change the angles of these things, and it'll help you distort the letters to fit into the shape. So if I draw, let's see, what should we write? Puppies. See how quickly I can go through these things once I get the hang of it. But I'm using the lines that have already been drawn by my block to speed up what I have to do. They're all the same height. They follow the form of whatever I'm trying to put it on. If you're doing a perspective drawing, it's super easy to do this. Now I've been doing it without spaces, but that's something you could draw in advance. But the nice thing is you can have the same height letters, right? And if I were to do spaces, I would just put a smaller space here. And I didn't really even use a ruler for this stuff, right? So if you have questions on that, it's a really fun thing to do, but I just want to talk about, you know, any other letter you should be able to do this to, but think about how to fit it into a box. So, you know, let's say an R, right? If I were to make this and draw it, I'm going to connect the bottom like this. These lines should kind of meet up, and there should be a line across the top. and you're basically just looking at the different shapes. Parentheses, and then look for that negative space in the middle, the capital D. This shape for an R, let's just draw one. Here's my box. Okay, I'm going to put my parentheses over here. That's a negative space. I'm going to create a negative space that looks like a capital D right here. But then there's a shape right here. It goes up and then arches down. I picture that if this was a capital D shape, kind of cut it in half. So I'm going to do that right here. And then we're going to do the same shape that was in the B, the seagull or the butt crack, whatever you want to call it. And we have a perfect R there. Now I'm doing these as simple block letters, and you can also change these up. But this will give you a lot of opportunity to start messing with the sizes of these things too. So we can talk more about how that happens, but I think you guys have a good start. And like I said, I'm happy to do anything else. I got to take a quick break here, and then I'll be back. But definitely let me know your requests in the chat, and I will be back in a few minutes. Alright, I'm back, baby. So you're probably wondering what else you can do with this. So I'm going to take out a ruler real quick, and I'm just going to set up some lines for myself to see what I can do with this technique. Think of this first set of lines as the height of your word. Alright? And then, if you want, you can do a ruler. I think I'm just going to split this up. And we'll see how it goes. If you want to find the center and you don't have number markings on a ruler but you do have a straight edge, one quick way to do that is by creating an X between the corners. So I'm just going to mark like a little light X here. So that is where the center of this box is, and then if I draw a vertical line through there, it's already split in half. I can do that again, and I can divide this up. So this can be really helpful, especially if you don't have a big enough ruler. And it might seem like this takes longer, but you're going to get a better result for what you're doing. Alright, so you see how that's dividing up? I can kind of lighten these lines with an eraser if I want to later. But notice I didn't have to use any measurement tools to get this split up like that. You'll kind of see what I'm up to in a second here, because it just takes a few seconds. Let's see. Okay. So now I know that I can split up these boxes again on the X, and I'll have equally divided spaces for my letters. So now I have 8 boxes here. Okay, there's going to be no spaces between these letters, but I think that should be okay for now. So let's think of a word that's 8 letters long. Let's see. Okay. I know this sounds silly, but let's see. A-N-D-E-R-S-O-N. Yeah, Anderson. So I'm going to write my own name here. Got a good mix of letters. But let's start with the A. So I'm starting up here. I'm going to put it into a box, and I remember those triangles. Now, this has a pointed top, but you notice in the last one that I had a flat top to it. I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to focus on trimming off and leaving this space in between, but I want to go all the way down to the corner. You can feel free to use a ruler for something like this if you don't feel comfortable trying to make your own straight lines. But the other key is trying to make sure that these two lines are parallel for this trapezoid at the base. Parallel with the outside line. Cut it off. And then imagine if these were to connect into a triangle. That's where you want to make this negative space inside of the A. For the N, it's pretty simple, right? We have an N. If we put that into a box, we have 2 negative spaces that are triangles. So I'm going to do this, but it's a right triangle, right? So take this, kind of copy and paste it in your mind right here. It doesn't go all the way down to the corner for this one. Just chopping down these things, and I have that N. But notice I didn't have to waste any more time drawing the outside line or setting how tall each one of these things are. Now the D, again, is a curved letter, but if I make a box out of it, you notice that that curve attaches to the right side, and these two parentheses are going to help us round it out. Again, though, we have to think about this negative space right in the center. So we have 3 negative spaces for the D. Bring a straight line down, and I'm making a capital D. This is the only one that kind of references its own letter, but you will see this capital D shape in a lot of letters. Now for the E, again, 2 rectangles. To make that a box, right? Just going to space them out. But I'm going to try to imagine where this line would be to keep the kind of parts of the letter the same width. So that's something you can kind of keep an eye on as you go. There's 1 rectangle, 2. Let's do that R again. So we put it into a box, parentheses, that seagull shape, capital D, and the top half of a capital D. So I'm going to put a small capital D in here, a parentheses right here, and then kind of extend where this would be about the same height. I'm going to try to adjust this so these parts of the letter are the same. I'm going to round this out, and it's like a capital D there. And then I'm going to put that seagull shape right here. Now for the S, remember, we're focusing on the same, we're doing this so it touches the top, the sides, bottom, right? So I'm going to start off with the parentheses at the top. Same thing at the bottom. And I'm going to do my parentheses here. Now, S's can be a little bit tricky if you're really focused on keeping the same thickness of the letters. Trying to get this curve right is a little bit tough. So I'm connecting inside with outside and inside and outside with inside. The O is very similar to the S in its start, almost identical. So same thing, parentheses at the top and at the bottom. A smaller set of parentheses facing each other like this. But instead of connecting with that S curve, I'm just drawing a straight line down. Right? And then we have one more N, which is just 2 triangles. You'd be surprised how quickly this gets done once you have the blocks laid out. So even if you were to hand draw and not use a ruler to do this, you're going to spend a lot less time drawing the letters and fixing like how thick they are, or maybe one is too tall. And notice all of them are the same height and the same width for the most part. Now what's really cool about setting these things up this way is if you wanted to make it 3-dimensional and use like a vanishing point. So let's say I make a vanishing point, I want these letters to come out at me. I can now attach all of these letters with a ruler, some of those corners, to here. So the trick of this part of the video is if you haven't done this before, you have to be very careful not to overlap certain areas. So like we can't see into that A too much, right? I kind of have a lot of chaos going on, so maybe I'll clean that up with an eraser real quick. So I'll take away these blocks that I don't really need anymore. But don't erase the straight lines, just where it overlaps with the negative space. You may not need that. That's the surprising part about this. Oops. Okay. Not the greatest of all time, but I'm using a darker pencil than I normally would just so it'll show up on the video. So if you do this, I'd recommend doing it with like a light pencil before you commit to any of your lines. It'll make it easier to erase some of these things that you don't need. Sometimes if you're going to be painting the letters, you don't even need to erase the pencil, because if you see it from far away, you won't even notice the pencil lines. Okay, that's a decent amount. So why don't we mess around with doing this perspective stuff. And I'm going to start connecting these corners. Okay. Now if I hit the top side of this A, it's going to run into the N right about here. So I'm going to darken up this edge of the N so you can see it. So the A is going to go behind the corner of the N. So we're going to just stop that line. But if it were to continue, it goes all the way to here, right? But it's stopped. So we'll continue with this bottom corner of the N. And this one is a little bit trickier. So this corner here, even if I did it, it's behind this part of the letter. So I don't need to draw that line necessarily. I'm going to focus on this corner. And keep moving down the line. The top of this N, though, will get a converging line. We'll go to here, but it's blocked by this side of the letter. Since we don't have any spacing, the N kind of shares this line with the D, right? But we are going to see some stuff when it comes to this curve, right? And we don't even know if we'll see anything here, but we will see something from this corner. So the inside of that negative space. I'm going to go here to the vanishing point. But will we see a line on this curve? Probably not. I'm going to erase this one so it's not so distracting. But what you will see is the corner where the E ends is going to get a line to the vanishing point. And to show this curve, though, we would have to show some shading to show that that curves in space. So it might be like darker over here. Right, it would be almost like a shadow. Okay, the E is flat on the bottom, right? So we're just going to see a flat shape here. But some of these areas, like this top one, you might be able to see a little bit. It's pretty faint, and my pencil is not sharpest right now. But this corner will see something, as will this one. So you're starting to see how the depth of these letters is super easy to manage, and it's always easier to have straight lines or right angles where you can get them when you're doing perspective drawing. So that's a really fast way to get those looking good. And we'll do some shading afterwards, but let's wait a minute. So I'm going to just connect some of these bottom corners. But again, thinking about the negative spaces is going to help you keep this thing organized. This line was out of whack, so let me erase that. Okay, now it's important to erase this line in the R because that's actually a space over here. I won't be seeing anything from this corner because it'll be behind this line, and over here this is another curve. But to shade that, I'm still going to kind of suggest you know, that this is darker, and it's going to kind of, all the shading is going to kind of follow to the vanishing point as well. Same thing with the D. Now the top point of the S is going to require us to do a little bit more work. Same thing with the bottom of this R, a little bit, but you can see it most with the S. Where do I connect it to? If I connect it to the bottom, it'll just look like it's one line. So we have to introduce a concept called tangent, if you're not familiar. So I'm going to put this aside for a moment. And I want you to think about this. Let's say I have one point here, and I have a circle like this. If I start with a line that comes from here, there's a couple ways I can come in contact with this circle. One could be like this, or it goes through, and it intersects at 2 points, 1, 2. So if you're gonna be going through a circle like that, if it doesn't hit the center, like you could have a line that goes to the center like this, that might have one intersection. So right here, this is 2. But in reality, this line would continue and connect there. So you're cutting that circle in half. Now the only other way to do to intersect with only one point is for using a tangent. Now what I like to do is think of this as like a lever. It's going to rotate from this point. Okay, and as soon as it touches the circle, just barely, that's where I'm going to stop and draw a line. It's about there. And notice that it just skims it. Okay, where that intersects only at one point, that's called a tangent. So when people say like, oh, you went off on a tangent, that means like you just skimmed the surface of a topic and then kept going on. You didn't really hit it head on like a normal intersection would. So with a tangent for the S, like for example, if this is the top of our S, and here's the bottom of our S, we'll just draw one here. Okay, we have to create a tangent somewhere up here and down here. So I'm going to use this ruler to slide up and see where I can connect. Okay, there's that one point, and over here, it's going to be about here. So that's what we call a tangent. So let's get back to the drawing. So for this S, I'm going to first remove some of these lines that we don't need anymore. So this is the curve we need to connect a tangent to. We don't exactly know where it's at without our ruler. So I'm going to start with my ruler here. And I'm going to turn it till it hits that line. This is really important. You can't just make this up. There's only one spot where you can hit it only once. That's the tangent. Now over here we have a corner, but the thing is it's hidden by the R, so we're not going to draw that. We do have another corner here, which you will see the bottom of that flat portion of the S. And then one here as well. Okay, but like this is all going to be relatively dark as well, so hopefully you can see this negative space happening. Now what about this curve here? We should connect it with a tangent, but we might not see it, so I'm going to test it. I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to slide my ruler on the to see where it intersects. It intersects right here at the corner, so even if I drew it, it would go behind the R, but it's still there. right? There's the tangent for the S, but we're not going to really develop that because it goes behind. Okay, same thing for the O. Now that it's moving out slightly, we're going to use the same tangent technique on the bottom. So here's our curve. We're going to slide up. Then we're going to draw our line. Looks good. We're not going to draw a line in here because it's rounded. There's no real corner there. And we'll test to see. Will we be able to see our tangent up here? It's essentially right here along the S, so we're not going to draw that. So the O is finished there, which is hard to believe, but with the shading we'll be able to see what happens. So here's our N. Finish that up, looking for corners. Guess I should erase that. Okay, we'll do the same thing, last few corners here, and we'll have a 3D version. Then we'll talk about some shading techniques to help this thing really pop out. One more corner up here. By the way, if you guys try this out, be sure to tag your photo on my Instagram. It's art with Anderson with underscores. So it's like this: art underscore with underscore Anderson. Excuse me. So tag that stuff. I'd love to see if you guys try out this lettering experiment. Okay, so we have all of our perspective lines. Oops, I forgot this top one. I think that's going to be it. And I'm going to start doing some shading. I will clean up the lines a little bit, but I don't want to make them too dark. So give me a second while I find my precision eraser. Okay. I'm actually going to try out a couple erasers here. So I got a kneaded eraser, and I got this new, I've heard it called a sock eraser before. It's pretty awesome. It basically just like lightens up everything on the paper, which might help us right now because we actually want to go over this again in detail. So I'll do like half of it just to see how it works. You see the difference? Like, I can still see my guidelines, but it's not as dark as that. This worked pretty well. Apparently this is for like cleaning up a sketch after you've been drawing for a while and there's a lot of smudges on the paper. Puts all this like gunk out, but it's pretty fascinating. So notice how much cleaner that looks, and I don't have as many of those dark lines that are interfering. So if you guys are in the if you guys are watching right now, send me a quick comment and say hi. If you want to see me do any specific letters, let me know. All right, so let me just grab my coffee. Now the key thing to think about before we shade this is like we're going to decide where our light is coming from. Now there's a couple ways you can do this, but it's always important when you're doing shading to think about your light source. So let's think of some light sources real quick. Most common is going to be the sun, right? So you have the sun, at least during the day, right? And it puts out light in all directions, right? But except when we get to Earth, like Earth is over here, all the rays that we get from that are basically really straight because everything else that goes out misses us. So all the rays from the sun are super straight. That's why, like, when you look at like the moon or whatever, like there's a really crisp shadow. You guys even see that? Yeah. So here's the sun. Here's the earth. We get very straight things. We also have light bulbs, right? Hopefully you're not still using those old Edison bulbs, right? Or you have your, you know, fluorescence, or you have an LED fixture. All those things put out light in most directions, but some of them have like a shade that will kind of soften the light. But we're going to be doing what's most typical is the sun. It's kind of like a direct light, okay, directly from the sun. So it's really easy to predict where the shadow is. So let's zoom in. If this were like the earth and it was getting sun directly from the side, it's really crazy, but the thing is this side is in daytime and this side is in nighttime. Perfectly half of the world if it was straight on. So that's why we have day and night, is our earth is revolving around, but nighttime is literally just a shadow. We're on the dark side of the earth and it doesn't get light again, but half of the earth is always in shadow from the sun's light. Okay? So if that's the case, if the light is coming from this side, the opposite side is in shadow. Okay? So think about light. It doesn't bend, right? Well, it does in, there's actually some really cool things like around stars. Light does bend because of gravity. It's really crazy. So we can actually see deeper into space because light bends around stars, creating a lens, but that's a topic for a whole another video. The thing is we know that light's not going to bend. If there was something back here like this, the light might bounce off and some of it might come over here and lighten this up. But in outer space, like, nothing is bouncing that light back at this side. Okay? But what's interesting is the moon is actually just like that. So for example, let's say the moon is up here, okay, and there's light that's missing the earth, but it hits the moon. There's a dark side of the moon, but the moon is bouncing light back at earth. So at night, when the moon is out, we do get more light on the night side. That's what's crazy about it, is we are getting that same thing. So if you've noticed that when the moon is out, we can see a little bit better at night. That's why it's reflecting those rays of the sun back at the earth. Okay, the same as if you have an apple on a table, okay, and there's a shadow behind it because the light is coming from over here. Well, the thing is that the table, if it's a light colored table, might be some of the light that misses the apple. The table might be bouncing some light back at this side of the apple, so it won't be like pure black. It'll actually be the darkest right here. It will be darker in the back in the shadow, but this will be lighter because of the light that bounces off of this stuff. So keep that in mind. Light bounces, but it very rarely bends, right? So let's go back to our drawing. And the beautiful thing about light not bending is we can predict where it goes pretty easily. So with this one, let's plan on having the light source like off to the side, but it's going to be slightly in front. We have to imagine it kind of like hitting above over there. So it's somewhere in space, like off to the side. So we're getting some light on the front, but it's above it. So I'll show you what I mean by that. Is, let's say right here on this R. Okay, so it's coming from over here. The R over here, this edge is going to cast a shadow onto here at some point. So what would be interesting is we can basically draw a line here, and basically everything behind this area is going to be much darker. You'll kind of see what I mean. Give me a second while I start shading here. Obviously there won't be a perfect line, But same thing on this one. We might see this D shape. It's casting a deeper shadow in that area. Still going to be darker inside. So we know that's overhanging, but the light will get through. This is the angle of that light. So for example, this means that it's kind of like level too. Like, I just want to show you that that can kind of create that sense of depth a little bit more. Alright, so let's think about like this corner here. This is the bottom of the R. Okay, the bottom of the letters are going to be darker anyway, right? So I'm going to just start shading those in. I'm going to focus on this E and R first. I'm shading the bottom of this R shape. So it's definitely darker than the front face of this. So since the light is going to be up here, we're not going to see like the area where it hits down at the bottom. So basically all of the inside of this E is also going to be dark. I might actually shade it horizontally like I did this one, so it'll look flat. But this wall, we might show it a little bit darker because we know it's definitely not getting any light. Same thing here. It's a little bit darker. And I'm just going to go like this. But the farther back it goes, the less light I'm going to get. So I'm going to make it darker as it goes backwards. If you're noticing how far I grip the pencil back, that's not on accident. I like to control this thing. Have you ever seen like Cruella de Vil in, or like some of those old movies where people smoke cigarettes and they're like holding it and tapping off the ashes? I like to hold it like that. I hold it this way, I can use my whole arm to shade, but then I can control the pressure with this finger. So if I need it darker, I just press down. So it works really well like this. If I need to increase the pressure, I just press down with that finger. Okay. So let's think about here. We have this light source coming through. And on this side, we showed it kind of coming at an angle, so this is going to be a little bit darker as well. I have to think about it for a little bit, but the one thing I didn't think about is, so like right here, since this line is perfectly above our vanishing point, we can't see the side of the R. It's facing us like right there. But we will be able to see the side of the S. So the light might come in and just cast a shadow over here on the S. So it's going to be a little bit darker behind there. And I don't know. This is where it gets tricky. The shadow is falling on a curved surface, but I'm going to do my best to shade this thing. But we're probably going to see it being darker the further back it goes. All right. Kind of weird. Let's try this up here. This is definitely going to be darker because it's overhanging. I still feel like I need to make this a little bit darker. Okay, and then we have our O. This is going to be mostly in shadow here. We can always use our eraser to fix some of this stuff. but we can see this side. I'm going to darken this line up a little bit so you can see it. Okay. Now at the bottom of the S, what should we do? We know that this isn't going to get much light, so it's going to be a little bit darker. We can't shade it flat like we did on these letters. So I'm just going to put kind of these lines that come out from the vanishing point outward to shade this so it looks like a curve. Okay. Same thing with the bottom of the O. It's going to be darker up here. Same thing with this N. How about the inside of this O now? Definitely going to give you a shadow, but just like the R, it kind of like casts a shadow, so we see some light on there. I feel like we're starting to get a pretty good effect here. We can still sharpen up some details, but we'll take a look in a minute. Hopefully you guys are starting to get the hang of this. Okay, here we go. Another one I'm going to put in this N. Notice how my shading strokes are kind of doing my best to go to the vanishing point. It's not always possible, but if you have to, use the direction of your lines to show which way you want your eyes to kind of like go, to convince you that it's part of the effect. I'm going to shade the bottom of this N. But I'm going to make this a little bit darker here. So we have like this, we have the shape going, and as things go farther away, we can't really tell too much detail, right? Like our eyes are somewhat limited. So let's work our way back over here. But this is the issue, is the light is coming from this side, right? So it's casting a shadow. We can see a little bit of light on the inside of these letters. And you can kind of tell the angle that it's at based on what you see. Like, it's not exact, but let's try same thing. These are in shadow, so they're opposite the light source. Sorry, I might have changed the position of the paper so I can shade easily, right? What's crazy is that once you practice this technique of holding the pencil, you can get much straighter lines, longer, straighter lines, than if you did it with your wrist. I'm also just going to shade the remaining part of the bottom darker to match the other side. We don't have any major highlights over here. If anything, we'll have to darken everything on the underside of here to show definition. So one of those areas is going to be right here with this A. I might have to redraw that line with my ruler. Got a little bit light while we erase that stuff. Nothing wrong with that. But I know for a fact that I do need to erase this line a little more. Just taking away that. Okay, here we go. I'll finish this shading underneath the A. But since it's directly opposite of the light source, I'm going to make it the darkest that we have so far. Same thing with this side for the A. I want to make sure I get that to be pretty dark. But for those of you who are really keen, would be like, oh, well, it's close to that N. That N back wall is going to be bouncing some light. So as it gets higher up, it'll be a little bit lighter, but it's still going to be darker than the front of our letters. This is starting to look pretty good. Let's put this shading in for the D. Again, it's pretty dark because it's inside. You might get a little bit of light bouncing around in there from that curve. Maybe from like there. I think this D might be a little bit of a shadow here, but let's draw out the curve of this D. So we know that it's going to be darker like up in here slightly, so let's just put a little bit of a curve shading on there. Alright, so this is looking pretty good, but you notice that like this is the most developed shadow. It's definitely the darkest dark we have on here right now. So we could go in and adjust. Right now I've been using a 2B Mars Lumograph Black, which is kind of like a regular pencil, but it does get darker. So I have a couple darker ones. Let's try, I have an 8B here. And let's just see if we can really start to sharpen up some of these areas. So you could use a ruler to really get these things in. But remember, outlining your letters at this stage is actually going to make it look a little bit more artificial. So I'm just going to be focusing on trying to get dark edges to really make the light edges pop. Sometimes you can't avoid making a line, but so there's this shadow. We might need to bring out a little bit more. And I might even use my blending stump to get this thing really cooking. It's still in shadow. I just want you guys to see that there might be a little bit of light sneaking around in there. Give me 1 second while I find my blending stump. Okay, so let's watch how this kind of darkens it up, but also blends it in. This is a good way, instead of using your fingers to do this, because it doesn't leave the oil that naturally occurs on your fingertips on the paper, and that can mess with how your materials stick to the paper, especially cheaper paper. But this has the effect of kind of softening up and blending these things in so they're smoother shadows. You don't see as many of those strokes of the pencil. Starting to look nice and smooth. We definitely went a little bit darker on this R, so let's smooth out some of these shadows and we'll make our final adjustments on this drawing. Like I said, as we kind of wrap this one up, let me know if you have any other ideas of what I should draw today. You know, I can do some more problem solving, like if you have a question on how to draw something, I'd love to like just jump on something like that. I just love after you do this, it's much more buttery and smooth. And it actually darkens it, which is weird. Alright, so I have a pretty good base here. And in some ways I don't really mind that this one's a little bit darker here. But I think we need a little bit more on this side of the D. I do get a little bit careful on the direction of my strokes when I do stuff like this, because you really can tell sometimes when people just get a little crazy. I try to keep them all the same. Kind of do your best to contain it. And then I guess we could do some lines underneath, which might help us a little bit. Sharpen up those edges. So I'll do one final pass. That'll really sharpen up our corners, but since I'm doing this a little bit darker, I want to make sure I get it right. So be precise. You gotta leave a little bit of a gap from where the point is and to allow the room for your actual thickness of your pencil, which can be tricky sometimes. This isn't the best ruler either. The other thing is, pay attention, even if you're not going to sharpen your pencil all the time, pay attention to if there's an edge that is sharp. Sometimes after shading for a while you get this kind of knife edge, it's flattened. And that's even sharper than if you get, fully sharpened pencil off of a regular sharpener. Sometimes I'll even do that on purpose so I can get almost like a knife, it's like a needle is drawing. It's really cool. I feel like that adds a little bit of definition. I'm gonna be honest, this would probably be overkill for some kind of sign you're making, but then again, it's a great exercise, especially if you love drawing in perspective. Might make a nice gift. But one thing is for sure is that you will definitely become a more precise drafts person practicing this stuff. It takes patience, a little bit of planning, and using your judgment. You know, sometimes these shadows are, like I said, it's an art, not a science all the time. It is a science too, but when you're forced to do it on your own, it can be a little bit tricky. Now, it is looking a little bit like, I don't know, there's just something about it like a little unbalanced, like especially this end. We could sharpen that up with a line in some areas where it's white on white. But I do have one other trick I'm going to try. It's not always the best thing, but this might work. Like if I'm too lazy to shade this whole thing in, what I can do is use, like I wear glasses all the time, so I use this glasses rag type thing. Excuse me. One moment. And essentially, what I do is use this to just move some of this stuff around and get like a light coat of whatever you're drawing with all over the paper, so you can really kind of like blend this stuff out or even out a tone you might have. And do this right before you're going to be doing like your final cleanup. So this is a good way to just blend all of your shapes together, and then you can use an eraser to really clean this thing up and make those whites really pop out. Can't really probably even notice the difference, but when I go in with an eraser, check this out. You can really see the difference there. See if I can zoom in a little bit more. So notice that can really clean up some edges. And then if I go into my like shadow edges, it'll just be a lot sharper. So I'm actually drawing with the eraser. Just be careful not to be tempted to use your hand to like wipe this stuff away. The best way is to have like a brush set aside. But if you use your hand, it'll not only smear it, but it could put some oils on there that'll be difficult to get off even with an eraser. Like think of the oils in your hand as like glue. They attract, especially graphite pencil, sometimes charcoal especially, and they basically glue it to the paper. So if you do need to erase it, you'll see these weird like fingerprint marks and stuff. So if you're really paranoid about it, get a second piece of paper to rest your hand on, because that, like if you look at my hand right now, it's like, I don't know if you can see it, it's got some charcoal on it, or pencil I should say, and it's really annoying. But sometimes if I'm working on a professional commission, I'll definitely do that. Tracing paper or wax paper sometimes works. I don't know if there's one that's better. But the cool thing about this is it's really popping out now, and I can clean up if I wasn't as precise as I needed to be on like shading those shadows. It's a great way to get some definition, some crisp edges. What I will say about erasing is think of it not as a rescue technique. It can be, but the whole idea is not being in a situation where you need to rely on a eraser to get a good drawing. Like we all make mistakes, but the thing is erasers sometimes can create more problems if you're using them to try to rescue something, because if you use them too hard, you might crumble up the paper, or you use it too quickly because you're panicking. Don't tell me how I know. I mean, it's just like every artist has definitely ruined a piece by erasing like really quickly, you know, kind of going at it like and then they crunch up their paper. There's nothing worse than putting in hours and hours and then making a silly mistake like that. So what I do is, again, I try to pretend like erasing is not an option. So that's why I don't go too dark too quickly. The darker or the harder you press, the harder it's going to be to remove it completely. But if you work patiently and you build up your darks slowly, you're going to have not only a better drawing, but you're going to have an easier time with putting those finishing touches on, cleaning up those things. So you can see that this is much brighter now and has cleaner edges, especially against that black, or the shaded area. And I also believe in trying to be smart about like how to use your hand. Like for these curves, I know I can't make that full curve, but I'll do that same curve over and over, and then turn the paper instead of trying to be, superhero and I got to draw this whole O shape at once. It's starting to look a little annoying, and I'm holding off on clearing these little specks of eraser stuff so I don't smudge everything. But I'm pretty pumped about how this turned out. You guys could probably see all the smudges down here. Again, not doing the best at managing that. Okay, 3 more letters to go. Almost there. Oh, the other thing about erasers, try to avoid that back and forth technique. Just do one stroke at a time. I'm not zigzagging. That's really when we're under a big threat of crunching up the paper. Slow down, be deliberate, do it right the first time, be patient, all those things we all know that we should be doing, but again, that's the thing with patience. It's something you have to practice and commit to. You just have to always remember that it's going to, if you rush through one step, it's going to take 50 times longer or more to try to fix something you could have prevented. Especially nowadays when we have so much work that's done on computers, we get addicted to the undo button. And when I work on the computer for a long time, like I use the keyboard shortcut, Control Z, sometimes if I mess up on a drawing and then I notice my fingers go like this when I mess up, like keyboard shortcut. So it's not good to be dependent on that. Okay, last step is I'm going to clean up these guiding lines that I had drawn before. They're a little stubborn, but an eraser like this Tough Stuff eraser stick, honestly, there's a smaller size which apparently is pretty awesome, but I've had this for several years and like it lasts pretty long and it's got some pretty strong removal. Okay. See, I used a dark pencil. I can't even get rid of those lines. Okay. So I'm going to just make sure that this brush is clean. Yeah, and I'm going to lightly try to brush this, or just shake it out. might seem a little finicky, but sometimes it's worth it if you just spend all this time cleaning up a spot. But the less you can smudge the surface, the better we are. Oh, sorry. Come on. All right. All right, that's looking pretty good. I wouldn't give this to a client necessarily. I don't know if a client would ever commission me to do something like this, but like I said, for our purposes, the reason I took you down this pathway is just to talk about like positive and negative space. We were able to get this result. I used a ruler for some straight lines, but other than that, these are all hand drawn. But we took advantage of those straight lines. It's the same height, and we were able to create this like perfectly, organized, three-dimensional, one-point perspective drawing. And I think you guys might have some really cool results with this. And remember, these are just the most basic forms. We could do a ton of stuff like changing, the thickness versus, we could add serifs, those little things at the edge. But that just about does it for me right now. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you catch this later, please leave a like and a comment, hit the subscribe button, and be sure to let me know if you have suggestions for future live casts. Or if you have questions from this video, if I can clarify in any future live casts, that would be great. But again, I'm Art with Anderson. If you did do something like this with your name or use it for something else, tag @Art with Anderson with those underscores on Instagram, and I would love to see the results of your work, whether it's digital or on paper or paint, or if you just make a cool sign and don't have those letters all scrunched up in the edge. Believe me, if you look closely at like the next, if there are sports gatherings or political rallies, you'll see people are not very good at doing these signs. So hope you guys enjoyed it, and be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.